I love talking about sharks because I love sharks and I love photography. And for me, sharks, there's all sorts of different aspects of their attraction, but really they, for me, represent the essence of wildness and also the health of the oceans. So often predators seem to be designed like an arrow with a clear purpose, and it's so evident to see with the predators of the sea, and sharks in particular being the sort of most emblematic predators. I'm just going to quickly run through the subjects we touched on last time and just a few kind of photographic notes on them. I started with this photograph because it was a really difficult photograph to take, and it had taken probably about 20 years of doing on and off trips to sharky places before I managed to get a behavioral shot of a scalloped hammerhead being cleaned by these butterfly fish and the king angelfish, and this was taken at Wolf Island in the Galapagos. So I'm really proud of it, and that's why I kind of made it the main photograph. It's sort of, they're probably the most difficult photographic subject of all the sharks because of their places they live and the environmental problems that are presented, and also because of their own sort of super shy nature, which I think is a sort of a side effect of the sensory apparatus that they've evolved. And then I started off talking about the benthic, the bottom-dwelling sharks, which can pass oxygen through their mouths, over their gills, and talked about photographic tactics. With other sharks, you often have to sort of talk about using relatively high speeds, the classic one being 1/250th of a second, because you want to get them as sharp as possible, and they're relatively fast-moving animals. But when they're on the seabed like this, you have to concentrate on points of focus, and really the aperture is your go-to control. There's no blue water, there's no need to light anything else. So no worries with ISO. You are lighting the sharks, and it's a sort of a controlled environment. And completely different when you know, these are the sort of the early sharks you see in a diving career. I've never had a really good opportunity with the blacktip, even though I've been to French Polynesia, where they're the kind of standout predatory species of the shallows. But this photograph sums up a lot of what I tried to do with blacktips. It was taken in Fakarava Island in the South Pass. It's more famous for grey reef sharks, but the perfect sign of a healthy reef, they do have these lovely blacktips and in the shallows. And what I tried to do while I was there was to photograph the environment and the shark to show that they are one. More benthic sharks, really the least inspirational of the sharks are the big nurse sharks, because you just look like you're interrupting somebody sleeping. But ka-ching, you know, this one I believe was in the Indo-Pacific. This is the Indo-Pacific version of the nurse shark, and then there's the Caribbean version. A little slightly more interesting. And the nice thing about the Bahamas and the Caribbean is you get these very beautiful sand flats. You can see the shape of the boat, but it makes a nice palette. The background means everything with this type of species. And one of my personal favorites, even though it's a kind of a benthic animal that doesn't move around much, is the leopard, or some say the variegated or the zebra shark, because there's a leopard shark that lives in California. And these guys are, you know, they've got this beautiful golden color, but they're very, very kind of shy of divers. So the photographic tip here is it really needs a really steady, cautious approach. You have to get down as far as possible onto their level and then move forward. In this case, I couldn't because there was coral there. So this was as low as I could go on this side. And this is the most kind of emblematic shark of all in many ways. It's the classic sharky shark, the grey reef shark, which again is the shark you see early in your diving career if you're diving the Indo-Pacific. You can tell from this photograph that this is in fact a film shot. This is a really, really old shot from when I was a baby photographer. And this is taken with a NIC 5 and a 13mm lens. So it's practically on my head, and was just a moment that I captured through sheer luck and got the exposures right, because in those days I was pretty much just pointing and hoping. And the same species in the French Polynesia, when you do get them in larger numbers. And their equivalent in the Caribbean is, of course, the Caribbean reef shark, a very social shark, which is why it's very easy to manipulate in feeds, and in this case by placing a bit of fish behind the coral head. So in this case, we're just photographing the spun coral head with sufficient sort of aperture to capture everything with a wide lens. Usually I'm using the Tachina for anything appreciably wide. I use a Nikon D. Everything in here is like from a D100 to a D500, usually with either a 16mm or a 10mm or the Tachina 10 to 17. And benthic sharks fascinate me, and wherever I go, if I hear there's a place where you can get them, I'll go out my way in a dive to try and get one for my list. I've photographed 36 types of shark, I think, and I've seen a lot more. I've maybe photographed about 42 if you count aquariums, which I don't think I can for this talk. This is a Galapagos swell shark, and you can see the dermal denticles that make up its skin in the foreground. But again, classically, it's a sort of a camouflaged shark and quite hard to make it stand out. There's the exact same problems you come across in the UK, where they tend to blend, this being the larger, the greater spotted cat shark, or the bullhuss. This is a big one. In a Scottish sea loch, you should be able to tell from the brittle stars, the feather stars, and they're just typically larger, very hard to identify between the two, but they're typically a bit larger. And this one was really sleepy. We thought he was dead and started prodding him, and it turned out he wasn't dead, and turned out he was quite angry. Not the greatest shot ever, but this was taken in less than 1 meter of visibility. So I'm glad I collected the species. A lot easier is to find the small spotted cat shark, which also sometimes have these kind of diamond shapes along its back. It really is one of the most underestimated photographic subjects in the world. British divers call them dogfish and write them off, but they are, well, you know how beautiful they are. I'm sure you all photograph them as well. And in this case, I broke the rule of don't chase something when it's moving. My rationale being that the dive site, the Burra in the Isle of Man, is so beautiful that whatever you photograph a moving shark against, it's going to look quite pretty. It's always a sort of a rewarding tableau. And then we moved on to sort of midwater sharks, and these are the black tips of South Africa, oceanic black tips. Quite small sharks, they look beefy, but they're 4 or 5 foot, and you get them at feeds, but you can tell they're oceanic. Look at the size of the pectoral fins, and they do light up this very beautiful gold around the front of the face. The lovely sharks in that regard. And for anything, this is a shark feed, so my tactic is to put the speed up to the setting I mentioned earlier on, average kind of aperture, and strobes on about 1/4 power, and just blat away, and just try and isolate them away from the feeding action, which I think sort of slightly cheapens some shark photography. And in the same location, the various caves where you get the braggies, which they're not on the seabed. They've masters of buoyancy. They sup air at the surface and keep it in their stomachs, and float with absolutely perfect buoyancy. Usually they seem to favor cover. In this case, these little sort of caverns. They've got a comfort zone. If you get too close, they sometimes expel the air and swim off really quickly, which can be quite traumatizing. My guides were convinced that if I went too close, I was going to get bitten. So these guys are about 1.5 meters away. You just got to work with what the guides want to do. We talked about flat sharks, like the angel sharks of the Canary Islands. A great reason for any photographer to go to the Canary Islands. The common angel shark is not common anymore. It's severely endangered. It's certainly on the red list. And it used to be really common around our shores. But now they think the last stronghold it may have is in Wales, where they're analysing DNA samples of the seabed to try and work out if the angels are still there. Fascinating animals, and when you approach them, some of them have got a comfort distance where you can pretty much touch them. Sometimes they're half buried, and if you're brave, you might want to try and fan the sand up around them, but you always get to a point where they swim off. And if you have the wrong lens, do take the opportunity to photograph their eyes, because these sharks have very kind of beautiful subject-worthy eyes. This is not a angel shark. This is Wobbegong from Raja Ampat, where I had some good opportunities. And here again, it's an opportunity because the shark doesn't move much to think about the backgrounds. I took about 200 photographs of this guy, and the main problem was the coral. You can see the rim of the coral overexposes compared to everything else in the photograph, as does the underside of the mouth of the Wobbegong shark. But in the end, I settled on this photograph because it sort of summarizes the kind of multi-layered action that you get there. We talked about scalloped hammerheads and how they're so difficult to photograph. And you know, as much as anything, you have to be prepared to grab your luck when a great moment presents itself. You might not have any time to photograph. You might never see the same thing ever again. And the sort of the other sharks of the Eastern Pacific, the Galapagos sharks and the silky sharks, look very similar. This is a Galapagos, I'm fairly sure, but it's quite a skinny one, so it looks a bit like a silky. And you're just using the classical settings of you know, the fast speed, as fast as you dare, and a sort of a mid aperture and whatever ISO in order to make the background look relatively nice. It's not great art, but it's it works with sharks. And you know, the great thing about sharks is they give you great stories. These being a lemon shark photographed with the use of bait from the back of a boat in the Bahamas. So my camera is on an improvised pole cam system, and we've got fish being chucked in very close to the dome port. In this case, I was using my old camera system, which was an Aquatica, and it had some really old damaged ports. So I devised what I call the sacrificial port, which was bitten by the sharks quite a bit, and still has bits of an enamel trapped in it to this day. And the great thing, lemon sharks, like Caribbean reefs, these are very, very social sharks. So you can get these shots of them layering up on a dive site. But in the background, sort of ugly and not what I want to photograph, is the baiting apparatus, which you can either take an honest photograph and include it, or you can try and concentrate on the animal. But really, baiting is just a way of getting close to the animal. On the right-hand side is a bad photograph of a shark that not many people have got photographs from. It's the sickle fin lemon shark of the Indian Ocean. Quite a rare shark to find for photography, and this was photographed at an atoll in the southern Seychelles, which is a lovely place to visit, very kind of off the charts. We talked about shark photography in Britain, and of course the blue sharks of Cornwall, which a lot of guys have been seeing recently. And again, it's just a question of spending time in the water and watching how they behave, and then choosing an individual that poses the way you like. This one had a habit of raising the head and lowering the fins as she approached the camera. And that translates, of course, to the oceanic white tips of the Red Sea, where really you're being investigated as a potential food source or a potential food predator. And everything you do when you're photographing adventurous oceanic sharks must be tempered with the fact that you are being constantly evaluated by them, and their behavior could shift at any minute. And it's your responsibility to stay safe, to keep your diving disciplined, and to notice when the behavior starts to amp up, usually towards the end of the day with a species. So that's where we were, and this is where we are. We've got to the mid-table and whale sharks, which are not my favorite photographic subject. I was talking about predators and non-predators having different sort of design aesthetics by nature. And the whale shark really is a grazer, although it sort of shares certain sort of predatory elements with other sharks. It has to locate plankton blooms. It has to come up with a tactic for funneling them into its mouth. But they don't seem the most intelligent of sharks to me. They swim up and down, they hoover up the plankton, but they are undeniably beautiful. And quite often photographing them from below doesn't work so well. The underside is mottled or pure white, whereas from the top side you get this unique design, which led to it being called the silver dollar shark in parts of Africa. This was taken off Djibouti, where your biggest problem, as in a lot of places with whale sharks, is bad visibility. So you're trying to get the light come over your shoulder. If you shoot into the light in these places with bad viz, especially as you have no strobe to compensate, you're never going to get a good shot. You want the sun coming over his shoulder a little bit, unless your water quality is really good. This is from the Maldives, where they're harder to photograph. because of other people. It's become a kind of a aspirational thing to do when you're in the Maldives. So whenever you snorkel with sharks there, usually at the southern end of Ariatle, it can become a bit of a circus. And then it's up to you to decide whether you want to participate in it or save it for another day. Once or twice, I've been in groups where we've said, look, let's just go off and have a dive. And once or twice I've been there and the situation hasn't been too bad. But I tried to record what I saw. The sharks are capable of swimming down and staying down when they feel it's too much. But I've seen situations clearly out of control there. This is another one from Djibouti, just to show how the water quality was changing. And it was run off, because in Djibouti the scenario is you're actually at a beach where there used to be, maybe still is, a Foreign Legionnaires camp. And you can hear them doing target practice on the beach a couple of 100 meters away. You stick your head out the water and they're shooting. And you just hope they don't get too bored and start looking for something else to shoot at. Anyway, this unlikely setting in Djibouti, there's this seasonal winter gathering of adolescent whale sharks. And my advice for whale sharks, if you can manage it, is to get a small one, because it's quite hard to photograph the largest of the whale sharks. They can be the same size, more or less, as a fully grown humpback whale. You know, they can be 12, 15 meters long. And that's a hard thing to photograph in terms of your depth of field, in terms of visibility. Visibility on this site was only about 8 meters. This shark's only about 5 meters. So it was kind of right for the scenario. And that, at least, it's not an attractive shot, but it shows you the behavior of what they're doing. And when they're feeding, the scientists call it ram feeding, when they go practically vertical in the water and start guzzling really dense patches of blue zooplankton. And that's what they're after. They don't want to be hoovering patches of water where the plankton is in light concentration. They want a nice, big, thick source of plankton. So it doesn't matter that there's tons of backscatter in the shot, because that's the story. And that's the story we're trying to tell about how it lives. This was all for one story, which involved the tagging of a whale shark off Djibouti back in 2004. So it's taken with a Nikon D100, which is now sort of seen as a comically primitive camera, but did the job. And what they're doing here on the right is diving underneath the whale shark to sex it before it gets chosen to be tagged. We eventually managed to get a satellite tag on one of these sharks, and it was monitored for a few months before eventually the satellite tag left the water and went for a stroll up one of the nearby hills. Well, it turned out a goat herd had got hold of it. But the great thing about spending a few days with the sharks is you stop obsessing over the obvious photographs and you start looking for kind of different angles like this, which was actually my favorite shot. I can't justify why. I used this as my screensaver for years because it just appealed to me. There's no logic for it, just what I like. That's the guy who managed to get the satellite tag on the shark. It was a bit emotional because as he fixed it on, he caught his thumb he was free diving and caught his thumb in the spear and the line. So the first I heard of it was when I was swimming nearby and saw the shark charging by at high speed with this little guy attached to it by his thumb. And it pulled him around for a few minutes before he managed to free himself. We had to take him to hospital. But that's the satellite tag, which ended up in a goat herd's house. So there you go. We called the shark Shiraz because red wine was the theme of the week on board the boat. It's a great thing to go away with scientists, and if you ever get an opportunity to do it, my advice is to, as an underwater photographer, never be shy of offering your services to the scientific community. They appreciate it, and it can give you access to great works. That's just a shot from the Red Sea from the brothers. I had the wrong lens. I had a 28mm fixed lens because I thought I was going in for oceanic whitetips under the boat. And it turned out that we had a big whale shark instead. So if you have the wrong lens, take a slightly different photograph of the subject is the only lesson there. And that was my my dive this year, believe it or not. I had a job to go to the south of the Maldives for the Times newspaper for a new voyage, a new route on one of the liveaboards out of the north. And it turns out these days they can attract whale sharks to the boat by using incredibly powerful lights. and just shining them in the water in a particular spot until the enough plankton gathers for a shark to come up and feed. You can see it feeding on the plankton off the end of the boat here. It took them about 4 or 5 hours to get it, so we went to bed on whale shark alert and were eventually woken. These are the only shots taken abroad so far for me with the new lens from Retra, the Retra Pros, which are lovely to use, very wide and nice quality of light, but I've not really tested them that well yet. And this is a story from this year. This is an imperfect shot of a basking shark. I went off with a few friends I met up with, and we went to Cole to use Basking Shark Scotland and Shane Wassick to try and get photographs of basking sharks. And of course, I'd had a really good early part of the season, and I was really enthused and wanted to sort of keep going. And he was having a good season reportedly, but we got there and the weather was hell, and my 4 days ran out quickly. We had 1 day blown out, so he gave me an extra day, and then the weather turned good. But the problem with basking sharks is your fellow swimmers. And in this case, I think it'd be a lot better if you stayed still and let them come to you, which was Charles Hood's tactic in Cornwall. But when you're dealing with a boatload of super eager people who've traveled from all over the world, inevitably they're finning quite hard to get into a good spot. And the shark senses that kind of commotion, and that's when it starts to close its mouth and change direction. So these are kind of the best shots I got from the trip. And they do show the scale of the shark and so on, but I regard it as kind of unfinished business. Ka-ching, another shark for my collection. Glad to have seen it. I've got a good story for the people who buy stories off me that don't depend on photographs. They're not particularly interested in newspapers in my photographs. They always use stock because that's the policy of the picture desk. But a really inspirational thing to see, and probably one of the biggest sharks I've ever seen, because I've only ever seen immature kind of whale sharks, but this is a fully mature basking shark. This is sort of 8 or 9 meters long, about as big as they get. In terms of photographic advice, ISO is your friend when you're working out what to do with basking sharks, because it's the limiting factor. The water's quite dark, and the shark's body is quite dark. It's moving quite fast, so no strobes whatsoever. They're not allowed anyway at the moment. Crowd control on Shane's part, which I respect. So you have to set a high speed, otherwise it'll just be pathetically blurred, and a relatively high ISO. The ISO is the god control in this case, and everything else follows afterwards. So a very similar shape. The reason I put great whites on after basking sharks is when you see a basking shark cutting through Hebridean water, which doesn't have the greatest clarity and it's quite dark anyway, you look at the shape and you do see a large cylindrical animal with a very big kind of central fin, and it does look like a great white in the water. I've only ever done cage diving, and I've only even done it twice, once in South Africa and once in Guadalupe Island in Mexico. And Guadalupe is far, far the superior option. It's a shit show in South Africa. Every criminal with a cage is happy to pitch in, and there's a big difference between good operations and bad operations. Sea conditions vary hugely. Visibility changes on an hourly basis, and half the sharks have been killed by orcas recently. So it's not somewhere I'd recommend offhand, but Guadalupe I certainly would. And you do get some very intimate encounters with the great whites there. I started off using no strobe, and then it became clear that especially when you've got the sun heading into you a bit, strobe is going to really matter. It's going to be really helpful to pick out details. We chose October as the time to travel, which is when you get the big females, but of course females are more scarred than the males. They're not as pretty as the males for great white sharks because they have to bear the brunt of great white shark foreplay, which is no gentle thing. Anyway, a little bit of strobe was good. We used strobes dialed down to the lowest kind of levels for this trip. But the problem is premium space inside the cages was really low. You can see the scars there. It's a pretty scarred individual. And you can't have your strobes wide apart. You've got to kind of pull them in close to the camera, but then turn them out a little bit. There you go. You got the scenario inside the cage, and that's probably on the earlier part of the trip, because that's Charles Hood on the far side, and he is not using strobes there. We quickly decided we wanted to. Some funny things happened on that trip. It was a very memorable trip. It was a rich guy who chartered the boat, invited some friends, and he'd filled the boat with really good wine from California, and titled the trips Great Whites and Great Wines. It was superb. There's a wine educator and a tasting set of 5 wines before every dinner. So I don't remember much about the trip, to be honest, but I do remember that the best place to be on the cage is on the outside. Charles is on the inside there, 4 people to the cage, and the best point for getting more access, better vantage point on the sharks is the far outside from where I'm taking the shot and then one along. There was one point where I missed my go in the cage, and I just sat and watched from the internal camera inside the boat. You could watch what was going on in the cage from a direct feed into the salon. And there was one point where one of the big 18-foot sharks, which is a huge, huge shark, got between the cage and the liverboard and started thrashing. So these guys got absolutely tumbled about. Well, I was sitting there calmly sipping my coffee, thinking, what a shame. It's one of the big females, with, as you can see, a little bit of flash. And in the end, that was probably the best shot I got out of the trip. This was 2004, when I was a baby photographer, a little bit still, getting to grips with things. And there's loads of things I do differently now. The D100 was an imperfect camera. The D200 came along, and I'd be happy to use that on a trip out. It's a superb camera. But if you look at this, you'll see the focus is more on the mouth than the eyes. It's got very, very kind of shallow depth of field, but it kind of works because it's a smiley shot, and there's an element of motion in it anyway. But really, I wasn't using fast enough speed, probably, because of failing light during the day. So it's one of those shots that just sort of cobbled itself together. And that gave me a taste for sharks and weird one-off single species trips. So in 2008, when I'd kind of really cracked into my photography a little bit more, my kind of, I think I get this year now, was 2007. So 2008, I was feeling a bit more confident. And some friends were talking about 6-gill sharks, which you get in the seas off Seattle, and also further north in Canada waters. There's a photograph by Eric Cheng, who's one of the guys that went with the founder of Wet Pixel. So this was the scenario. They had a sunken cage, and you're diving at midnight in the Puget Sound, which is brown water pretty much. And they baited the water heavily with bits of old salmon from Pike Market in Seattle. And eventually the 6-gills turned up, and I knew a bit about sharks then. It's something I'd always obsessed about, and I knew that opportunities to see a proper deep ocean big shark, this is the size of a tiger shark, this is a 14-foot shark, are pretty rare. You've got to kind of really count to luck to see them in most places. So this temporary baiting operation, which was set up, I saw as a great opportunity, and spent a bit of time with these 6-gills. Amazing animals, really unusual in that they seem to have a way of backing off. They could almost reverse swim, which I've not seen in a shark. But as you can see, it's a bit of a rough photograph. I'm using an ISO that's that's too much for the camera's capability, and the focus is all over the place. And that's down to me being jet lagged, cold, confused, you name it. I wasn't really on top of this as an operation. Sometimes it's good to give you a few days to sort of really decompress when you hit a location like this, but I was off the plane and diving within 24 hours. And we only had one really, really good encounter in 3 nights. But what was good about a trip like that is that you do get a chance to see other things. And although I was a bit disappointed with my shots at the time, they've stood me in good stead because it's not a common subject. It's a bit of a kind of a one-off. And as I say, there were other subjects we managed to mop up at the same time. They call these rabbit fish in Seattle, but I call them ghost sharks or chimeras. And whenever you buy a book on sharks and rays, there's usually a small chapter on chimeras, because they too have cartilage skeletons, and they are very distantly related to sharks. So I'm cheating here and putting in the chimera in for a Kaching additional species. They're about 1.5 feet long and reflect these crazy colors, sort of a pinky kind of gold hue, which for me was beautiful. I was a little bit nonplussed by the fact that most of the six gills were actually black, not even grey. So black sharks in black water at midnight was just one of the more tricky things to do. They weren't tricky like hammerheads are tricky with their shyness. Their behavior was more like a tiger shark, in fact. But they were just in this difficult environment. So the chimera was a nice way to get a little reward out of it, as were these kind of spiny sharks, Kaching and other species, which were attracted to the bait alongside those Dungeness crab you see there. This is a mini story about bull sharks, which is really the species that started off my kind of expeditionary interest in shark photographs. Pre-2001, there were no really kind of usable photographs of bull sharks out there. Doug Perrine, who's an incredible chaser of sharks, had photographed bull sharks in the Bahamas, but he was the only guy. And they found a place at Walker's Key, which is in the northern Galapagos of the Bahamas, where you could snorkel with them off the end of a runway. So these are some rubbish photographs. I was a baby photographer when I was there, but you could get in the water and just snorkel with pretty big bull sharks. And it was, nobody really knew anything. There were a lot of shark experts saying that they were going to kind of kill you, and they were the sort of the most dangerous man-eaters of all, because they've been recorded going up rivers in bad visibility where they kind of bite first and ask questions later. And there've been these studies into the mechanism of their bodies and the fact that they have huge amounts of adrenaline going through their bodies. The famous quote was, "More adrenaline than a charging elephant." But actually I found them pretty placid and quite hard to get close to. This photograph's affected by visibility, the fact it was taken on a film camera and badly scanned, and also that I was snorkeling and there's not enough speed. So it's a really imperfect shot. Shows you what I was doing at the time. And then earlier this year, I got an opportunity to go to the Bahamas, and there in Bimini, which is famous for great hammerheads, they just have bull sharks in the bay there, and they just stick a cage over in the water, and you can buy an hour in the cage with a regulator surface fed down to you, while a local chucks fish in the water. And as you see, it's very similar to the scenario I saw at Walker's Key, which I visited with Jeremy Stafford Deitch, who was kind of my hero before I got into dive journalism. His books were the best, and he told amazing adventures about looking for sharks. So he's kind of my inspiration. And bull sharks were this kind of big mystery at the time. So when I got an opportunity to photograph them earlier on today, it was like coming home. As you can see, that they are a bit kind of monolithic looking sharks, and they always have this way of approaching and then turning the nose up so that the eyes leave the picture, which I don't like. So I tried to manipulate a scenario where the eyes can sort of just about be visible. That's just the way they approach the cage. The water's green, of course, because it's a harbour, and all sorts of people turn up. And just after I got out of the water, a load of French tourists turned up and were about to jump in for a swim. And I really had to persuade them that it wasn't the greatest idea they've ever had. Again, going back years and years and years, this is a photograph of a great hammerhead. I enjoyed this early bull shark trip so much. When we were in the Northern Bahamas, we met Jim Abernethy, who just started going out to old spearfishing locations to find big sharks on his liverboard, the Shearwater. And when I heard stories about the great hammerhead and how it was the sort of beefed up cousin of the scalloped hammerhead, but then it's a cryptic animal, it doesn't like being seen, I became again obsessed with the romance of this animal and wondered if actually seeing it would live up to expectations. And this was the crowning photograph of 2 expeditions, which doesn't look great by today's standards. It's a film photograph scanned again, but at the time it was good enough to make the cover of BBC Wildlife magazine. And that was kind of my entry into the world as a photographer. And there's a very good drum scan of it somewhere, but most of my old film photographs are they're all scanned on rubbish dive magazine scanners. They don't look very good. But that gave me the confidence to look out from being a writer to being a writer photographer. That was kind of my way into that transit into that kind of world. And because sharks make better stories, you get loads of photographs of nudibranchs. I love nudibranchs, but you don't get nudibranch people telling amazing stories after the dive. The atmosphere in a shark boat after a dive is so amazing. Everybody's buzzing. Because sharks are stories. They make superb stories because their range of behavior is so astonishing. And the great hammerhead is a very intelligent shark with a wide range of predatory, inquisitive behavior. And also the opposite, it can revert to being cryptic and not liking to be seen. Yeah, that's another shot from the time. Nearly cut the tail off, but again, taken on film and very pleased with it at the time. And weirdly, I gave it to charity. I gave it to the Shark Trust, and it eventually found its way out in high-res format online. And I was watching Monty Hall's recent program about Galapagos, and when the locals staged a protest in the Galapagos about some recent shark findings, it was my photograph they ripped off to my absolute pleasure in order to make their signs. And I was really, really happy about that. And it shows that really there is a reason to give your shots away sometimes, if some good can come of it. I was really proud about that. And I went, as I say, I went back this year to Bimini, and I got a chance to see what it's like there now with the feeds and so on. And this is Nemesis. It's a superb name for a shark. It was a 13-foot great hammerhead, 13, 14 foot. And we had a lot of fun. But there are all sorts of problems that can pop up in this shooting scenario as well. And the main one is current. If you've got current that's blowing over the site, it's an organized feed. It's very orchestrated to a degree that I found a little bit frustrating. Very nice for them to bring the sharks in. They're very good at doing it. But when bubbles kind of fly across the feeding zone like that, they can get in the way of the shots. There's nothing you can do about it. We were really weighed down. They made us weigh like 3 or 4 times as much lead as we normally would, because they want to control you and keep you on the sand, especially if there's a big current. So I wasn't a fan of the sort of overt feeding techniques they use there, but it's what they do. So before I try and kind of get another shot, a separate shot, you photograph what's there. And it's pretty amazing to have 2 fully grown great hammerheads steaming in on a small Italian lady. I'm impressed by the bravery of the feeders, but what they ended up doing a lot was manipulating the shark and directing it by grabbing the hammer and sort of using an upward motion to make the sharks go over the crowded the line of people behind the shooter here. I'm using, by the way, a Tokina 10-17, mostly at the 17 end of the range. I could have done with something a little tighter even, because as the sharks approach, they approach head on, which is a nicer shot. And you can crop. Whenever you're photographing sharks, if something's too confusing, crop like you mean it. And there you can see, it's a situation which sometimes can get out of control. And in this case, the shark sort of approached her a bit quicker than she was anticipating, and more or less lifted her off the ground. They're so strong, and they don't give way to anything. And you can see again the problem with the bubbles in that situation, and also these kind of jackfish, which are super reflective and get in the way. These are all the kind of things you've got to work against, or make them work with you. And these are all crops where there's something else hideous in the photograph. You know, one shot celebrating the feeding aspect, one shot keeping it out as much as possible. But I'm fairly sure there's a woman falling over or belching or throwing up, whatever. There was a lady before the dive who, you know, there's always someone who wants to lecture you because they've done the thing one day more than you. So you get on the boat and this woman was telling me, you know, all the things I shouldn't do. I thought she was the dive guy, but she was just a punter. There's always somebody with a pathological need to tell you what to do. And we did the dive, and every photograph I've got where she's in the shot, she's belching unnatural amounts of bubbles because she's scared. She's one of these people who's prompted to do something because it scares her to make some kind of point. But this is what I arrived at. The great hammerhead is defined by the way it can move. That cephalofoil makes it highly maneuverable and also is used as a predatory aid, can pin down big prey like eagle rays on the seabed and keep it pinned down where it systematically bites off the pectoral fins and then swallows the rest of it whole. It is a proper alpha predator, the shark-eating shark, and I've never seen anything that can turn as quickly as a grey hammerhead. For something so big, its agility and the spikiness of those fins, the big central dorsal fin, make it probably my favourite shark at the moment. If the great white shark's the B-52 of the shark world, then this guy is the stealth bomber. He's got sci-fi angles and really kind of has to be seen to be experienced. But then we're talking about intelligence earlier on, and from what I've seen of tiger sharks, they may be the most intelligent sharks. Highly adaptable, capable of eating just about anything, and very, very unpredictable in terms of how they treat divers. In the Bahamas, which is easily my favorite place to photograph them, the tiger sharks are kind of quite sort of calm and not fazed by the presence of divers. Whereas, you know, if you go to the Red Sea, you can tell that grey reef sharks are quite agitated and territorial when they see divers. But in the Bahamas, this is very, very calm animal. It's not scared of you at all, which means that they can approach really close. This was taken with the taquina, and you can have them, you know, a matter of inches in front of you. So you have to do what I call the tiger dance. You have to hold your camera at sort of waist height and use that as the object between you and the shark. And eventually the shark has to either go through the camera or go to one side of it. It's not panicky. The approach is measured. So you have to make up your mind before this kind of happens. Are you going to go for a big wide shot of the whole shark? You're going to pull your strobes in, turn them down almost as much as possible, and meter the thing for a close focus wide angle. This is just a bit further away, so the strobes are further out, tiled up a little bit more. And you get these lovely backgrounds at Tiger Beach. I was actually there when Tiger Beach was invented. It's a creation. When we were doing those early Great Hammerhead trips, the sites we were visiting were really exposed. So Jim Abernethy started baiting this relatively sheltered sandbar, and that was Tiger Beach. I have no doubt there were tiger sharks there anyway, but that was really the start of what became Tiger Beach, and it became, you know, a world famous dive site in its own right. But this is Emma, who is the most famous of the tiger sharks there. I believe she's still alive. She's bigger now. This was taken 2006. So I think she's now probably 15 foot. She was 13, 14 foot then. And that's the liverboard, the sheer water above her. And the behavior you see with her and Jim, or the other kind of habituated guides that she knows well, this is clearly a seriously intelligent animal. In Papua New Guinea, I got an opportunity to photograph silvertips. And if you look at these shots and the relatively good sharpness and quality, you can tell the difference between of what I've learned over the process of photographing sharks. All the kind of blurriness and cut off fins and funny angles that you see on my young photographs are gone. I know what I'm doing now. I get well briefed before the dive. I make friends with the guy doing the feeding to make sure I get a good spot. I know what to push for, and in this case I know what sort of strobe settings to use as well. Always manual, by the way, and in this case I was using Inon Z240s, pulled right in because I was expecting them close. And silvertip's one of my favorite species of shark because they're like beefed up versions of grey reef sharks, but they've got very, very expressive eyes, very, very fast moving sharks. When you're dealing in a feed like this off the end of a reef, the problem you have is, of course, backgrounds are not amazing. So just keep an eye out for, you know, passing fish, anything to contextualize it and stop it just being a pure kind of blue photograph. And in this case, we got lucky because the resident school of Barracuda and a site called Kilibob's Knob. People from Papua New Guinea love to give dive sites funny names. And Kilibob's Knob is some kind of Australian joke, I think. But anyway, there's a resident school of barracuda there, and if you wait long enough, they might swim in front of the feeding zone, which is what happened, and gave me a slightly more memorable kind of shot. Less technically excellent, because in order to get the shark relatively big in the frame, I was using the Sigma, it's the 17 to 35. So I had to go closer to the 35 end. So I don't think there's a lot of strobe light getting there. You can tell I've worked it in Photoshop a bit to try and bring out what I could. Works better as a black and white, to be honest, but it's a photograph of a shark in front of a load of barracuda. And we're going to end, you'll be mercifully relieved to hear, with a lovely challenge I took on in 2015. I'd not been diving for a while, and I got an opportunity to go to Malapascua in the Philippines, which is actually a kind of just about a backpacker type destination. Get quite a lot of people passing through, but they have a nearby seamount called the Monad Shoal, which is famous for these guys, the thresher sharks. And again, I'd learned a lot of my early lessons, and I knew that I needed to use my journalist privilege to get permission to use flash. Now it's kind of crowd control there, that you can't use flash. And actually, if I went back, I probably would completely go along with that law. But I made friends with the center owner before I left, and negotiated the ability to use flash. And I was there for 10 days. So the guys got to know me. They knew I wasn't blatting away. What they're trying to prevent is a situation in which, they got 20 people using flash. That will send the shark away. But actually, we found if I used the lowest possible settings and a high ISO, I could get relatively good pictures. If I went back, I would probably not use flash, because my current camera has such a good ISO setting. You actually get really nice shots if you position yourself relative to the sun and don't use any flash at all, but a high ISO. So most of these are taken on about 1000 ISO, and you can kind of see the grain. If you look in the bottom left side of the picture, you can see the warped pixels and noise. I was using a D7200 then. It's not the greatest camera, so I'll use the same tactic any respecting photographer will do, and I'll put it to black and white, because that seems to handle grain better. And eventually I got the shots I wanted. I wanted a head-on shot where you could see the tail as well. That was my kind of dream of the dive. And I exposed this correctly. If I was shooting without a strobe, I'd overexpose it and then work it heavily in Photoshop to very roughly. I'd work every setting possible in the black and white section. I'd probably use Silvertone, and I'd bang up the contrast a lot. But with the strobe, you don't have to do that. It's a bit of a cheat for me. Sorry about that, guys. But it meant that it could highlight the face, and you can even see the little parasites, copepods, on the face of the shark. And that's why the sharks come to the shallows. It's a deep water shark, and it will only visit the shallows for a brief ritual that takes place when the half moon wrasse wakes up in the early morning, and the shark can only stand the pre-dawn light, which is why you're shooting in sort of semi-lit conditions most of the time. By the way, this contrast is, I got hold of some unusual new software that reduces noise. So that's previous with noise, and that's without. I don't know if you can tell much difference, but it's a bit revolutionary. I won't say what it is just yet, because it's still in development, but it's very promising. And again, the same angle that I look for with sharks a lot, slightly uplifted, just a kiss of flash on the nose, and then just ambient light around it. And I'm not worried about the fact that there's no other kind of things there in the picture to give it context. The shark is the star of the show. And the thing that kept occurring to me as I was photographing was, it's an early morning, very early morning, on a seamount in the Celebes Sea, and I'm floating in inner space with these animals I never ever thought I'd see. It's absolutely magical. I don't know what makes it so strange. It's the fleeting, fragile nature of the encounter. The fact that it's only a little short time window where you can see them. And this is what happens when you don't use much flash or any flash, and you can overexpose it. and then kind of bring the shark back in levels or with contrast, basically. And that's the noisy version, and that's the version that's been denoised for you. And it's going for this kind of slightly white background thing that's fashionable these days. And that's what I decided. I thought, is there a reason to photograph the shark in this kind of stylized way with a kind of a brighter background? Well, there is. There's kind of a storytelling justification for it, which is that when the shark comes up, you can see its big eye. It's viewing the world in a kind of overexposed way. Everything's too bright for it. It's specialized for hunting squid in the abyss. So it can only tolerate light that bright, which for us is kind of twilight, really. So it's seeing things in a slightly overexposed way. And some people say in black and white as well. I don't know if that's been proven. So there's a sort of a philosophy for it. And this is kind of the last shot of the trip. This is the last day. They're very shy, but every now and then, if you put the time in, and this was the end of 10 days, 2 days when we were skunked, the rest of the time we had on-off opportunities. And this was the last dive, and one kind of swam right over me. And if I'd had a Tokina lens instead of the 20mm I was using, I'd have got much better shots. But this is where we kind of left it. So that's the story of me and sharks. I really hope you enjoyed it.